This is Matthew, host of the Superhero Ethics Podcast, and I've got an ethical question for you. If I'm trying to help you not listen to ads, is it ethical for me to do an ad to help you do that? If you go to our website, theethicalpanda.com, and just click on the join button, for $5 a month, $55 a year, you get to hear all of our episodes without ads. Was I ethical in doing this? Let me know. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew. Joining me, as frequent these days, is Paul Christopher Hoppy, a.k.a. the Zen Madman, a.k.a. the first host this podcast ever had, a.k.a. I think the fourth regular host this podcast ever had, and now returning guest. And we're talking today about spies. We're talking about secret agencies. We're talking about Denmark and its capital city of Copenhagen. Except no, we're not talking about anything in the news. We're talking about the Copenhagen Test. We're talking about my bad pronunciation and how I'm still getting over a cold and why my voice is a little screwy. Paul, jump right in. How are we doing today?
A little unsettled that I really don't know how to pronounce Copenhagen. That's how I've always pronounced it in English. I think that's the standard American English pronunciation, but
I think it is, yeah.
Don't know any Danish. I really only know how to say, like, do you speak English in Swedish? So, like, that's not super helpful.
Well, I'm going to throw you back onto at least somewhat more steady pronunciation land for you, if not for me, and say, for those who don't know, this is the new show starring Simu Liu.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's
cool.
Yeah.
Who many of you might know because he played Shang-Chi. He played, he was one of the stars of Kim's Convenience. And this is a new show out on Peacock that we're not going to do, as normal, we're not doing a review of it here. We'll probably talk about that somewhat, but we're going to be talking about the issues it raises. I do think it's quite a good show, so if you want to hit pause, watch it. It's only 8 episodes. But also, if you haven't seen it, it brings up episodes. It brings up a lot of issues similar to the Bourne Identity. It brings up a lot of things similar to Burn Notice. At one point, it looks like it's going to bring up some of the romantic issues from Cyrano de Bergerac, but it doesn't do that, which is, I think, quite a relief to some of us. Paul, overall, what do you think of the show?
I thought it was good. I didn't love it, but I really enjoyed a lot of aspects of it. And I mean, I watched it in like a day or two. So, it was certainly, you could call it a psychological thriller. That's how my dad always would get my mom to go to see a movie. He's like, no, it's not this or that. It's a psychological thriller, not an action movie. And I'd say that's like actually pretty accurate here. The first episode has a very like kind of Bourne Identity, early in the Bourne Identity kind of feel. The second episode does a big pivot, and I had a sense of what I thought the show was going to be, and then it kind of went in a different direction. I think it's interesting because it's, talking about, United States spy agencies. And I was kind of a little wary and curious kind of what sort of stance the show was likely to take. Because we've talked about how, spy stuff has gone from maybe being a little more pro-spy agency to more anti-spy agency. And I would say it kind of doesn't take a stance in a way, at least for the bulk of it. It kind of almost sets up a question for the second season, if there is one, of kind of maybe the show might have more of an opinion. But there's an extent to which I appreciate that. I kind of like fiction to set up questions and not be like, oh, but this is the answer,
Right.
Sometimes, not always, but often. And so it didn't feel heavy-handed to me in a way that I appreciated. I think it's well executed by and large. I liked the performances. I like spy stuff in general, and I like Simu Liu. So I was like, yeah, I'll check this out. And I watched the first episode. I was like, huh. Okay, I'll watch the second episode. And I was like, all right, well, now I have to watch the third episode.
I like the phrase psychological thriller. A phrase that I've started using for shows like this is a TV page turner. A page turner being the thing that the ancient Jedi texts are not, according to Yoda. It's the kind of book where just like, you're enjoying it, you want to keep turning the pages. It's kind of hard to put down. And this felt similar in that there were some episodes I thought were really good, some I raised an eyebrow about, but I was never like, okay, you know what, I'm fine hitting pause and going to sleep tonight. We stopped after 4 episodes because we were exhausted, but like I wanted to keep watching, which is about as much as I can ask for a show a lot of the time these days. And from the very beginning, it sets up a number of ethical questions that, of course, we're going to dive into here. And the name of the show, the Copenhagen Test, is itself an ethical question that we're going to dive into. But I want to start actually with kind of what you were saying about the lack of pushing one idea or another, because I think they do that in a really interesting way that's worth talking about. And here we're going to have a huge spoiler. So again, if you want to watch the show, hit pause, go watch it. That a lot of times when you have one of the things that you do to sort of justify whether or not we're supposed to be rooting for the U.S. spy agency or not is tell us who they're against. And, well, they're against these people who are clearly bad. It makes it a lot easier to say, well, I don't like the methods being used by the U.S. spy agency, but maybe they're okay. And or when they're pitted up against someone who has a different ideology, then maybe it's the opposite. And maybe it's like, well, maybe actually we shouldn't be quite so afraid of this other ideology. And maybe that doesn't justify the terrible things they're doing, if anything does. And they do something that I don't think is a cop-out, but I think is actually is becoming a little bit of a trope, at least as I see it, as a way to say we're not going to ask you to think about that particular question yet, which is that the villain doesn't have an ideology. They're motivated by, on the one hand, money, and on the other hand, revenge, personal revenge. So that pretty early on, we learn that this isn't being done by the North Koreans, as it first seems it might be. That it's not being done by, like, neo-right-wing groups. It's being done by a group that is just selling the information. So, actually, let me back up a bit and give a bit of a plot explanation. Again, huge spoilers. The main plot of it is that Simu Liu works in an intelligence agency, has not quite become a field agent with them, but is kind of hoping to be towards that. He, at one point earlier, had been a special operations soldier and had been faced with the Copenhagen Test. We'll get to that later. But he has been biohacked in that the signals from his eyes and his ears are being coded by these nanites in his blood and in his brain, and then sent out via Wi-Fi from his brain to others who can pick it up. And that's basically like it's like he's a walking, talking spy camera for this group that we don't know about. If that sounds technologically far-fetched, I think this is, in what I think of as the best traditions of science fiction, they don't try to explain it. They just say, here is the science that is creating the fiction we want to tell you. If you're willing to accept that, great. And I was never too deep on, I don't really believe this. It was a couple leaps, but I was fine with it. But the point that I'm getting to here is that we figure out that the group that is gathering the secrets is just selling them to other groups rather than having a specific ideology of their own. And later we find that the person who we're introduced to as the leader of it for right now, it turns out it's kind of a Russian nesting doll, and season 2 is going to be the next layer up, and we'll see about seasons 3 or 4. That he's also out for personal revenge, that he got really badly screwed by the person who leads this operation, who leads the orphanage, which is the super secret organization that they have. But so there isn't an ideological motivation that the U.S. is being pitted against. What'd you think of setting that up as the villain we were looking at?
Yeah, I feel like it has become very common. I don't know my Bond that well, but when I think about Bond villains, I think most of them are like not, there's like USSR related stuff a lot back in the day, especially, but at least more recently, it feels like most of it's been, somebody just trying to make money, basically, right? Like holding humanity hostage or the United States or whatever for personal gain or for personal vendetta, see GoldenEye. Or even Skyfall, I think, has that same sort of vendetta kind of motive. I've never found revenge to be the most compelling storyline, usually. It didn't bother me so much in this one the way it did in various seasons of Arrow. But I think first of all, I'd say that this series definitely benefited from being 8 episodes in this season. It was able to have that momentum and be that, on-screen page turner, as you said, where if it was like a, old school 22 to 26 episode season, I feel like this whole thing would have dragged a lot. So, and similarly, I think when you're going to have a villain who's really more of like an antagonist, they've got their own thing that they're doing, but it's not this deep ideological thing. I think maybe that plays out better over a shorter term as well. So, I feel like this is a very common way of kind of sidestepping the whole, is the overall mission positive or negative? And just kind of like, well, we're dealing with an individual who's clearly trying to do some, bad stuff like killing people and whatever, for personal gain or for personal reasons. And so we kind of don't really have to confront their ideology as something controversial, and we don't have to like say, oh, how has US policy like shaped their ideology or their reaction, even though in this person's case it actually was, a US agent and a US spy organization's actions that led to this person kind of having this vendetta.
Right. As a quick summary of that, his name is Schlitz. He was an East German who had been spying on behalf of the Americans and had gathered information about KGB agents operating in the West, and was going to provide that over to a U.S. spy who goes by St. George. And then it turned out the day that they're supposed to make contact, they say it's in 1989, is the day that the Berlin Wall falls. And basically, in the midst of all of that, the U.S. agent decides that trying to reach up with this guy is not worth the risk, that the KGB is about to disappear from West Berlin. So why do we need to worry about this? And as a result of that, she's supposed to help him get away. He doesn't get away. He gets beaten up by the East German police, and his leg is hurt. He walks with a cane for the rest of his life, etc. And yeah, I think you put it exactly right. Is that sometimes I think I get frustrated when a show is asking so many questions that they all get kind of muddied. And in this one, I think they use that, what is becoming a trope, but they use it to kind of say, we don't want you questioning the goal yet. This is clearly something bad that should be stopped. The question now becomes the methods that are being used, because there's an awful lot of collateral damage, because one of the things that they decide to do is to keep the hack open, is to basically like leak information out to this group through Alexander Hale, the name of the character, played by Simu Liu, as a way of like tracking down. And along the way, there's collateral damage, like individual people, but also like the political system of the nation of Slovakia, where basically like they allow someone to kill the legitimate president or kill someone who's
running for
who has a chance to overthrow what is at that point a dictatorship, and they basically like stop that chance in order to keep the hack open, etc. And we'll talk about all that, but let's actually just start with the name of the show itself. The Copenhagen Test, according to this, it's interesting because I think we're going to look at it as an ethics test, but it really is a loyalty test, and that's kind of the point. The idea is that you are in a special operations soldier situation that has gone wrong, and the enemy is hunting down the allies that you are trying to rescue. Your job is to find someone. There's one spot left on the rescue helicopter, and you're specifically ordered to rescue an American, to prioritize Americans. And in this case, it happens in Belarus, but it could happen anywhere. A native boy, a Belarusian boy, comes up and says, "Hey, please save me. I'm about to be killed." And the person undergoing the test is supposed to encounter that person first. Of course, develop an emotional, it's a little kid who needs to be saved. And then later, an American comes along, a grown-up, a woman, to say, "Wait, you're supposed to rescue me instead." And then the question is, which one do you rescue? And in the story, our hero does what I think a lot of us would expect them to do as a hero, rescues the kid and says to the woman, another helicopter is going to be back soon. Please just wait a little bit, and rescues the kid. which is, I think, what a lot of people, I think myself included, think is probably the more moral choice, but is directly violating the orders that he was given. And that kind of sets him off in this, the fact that he, by the definitions of the people setting the test, failed the test, is a big part of what kind of launches the plot and how other people are looking at him and stuff like that. And of course, at a later point, what is brought up to him is that there actually was a third option he could have done, which is to save both of them by himself staying behind and not taking his spot in the helicopter. It's a kind of a trolley problem, and I could nitpick it and say, like, why couldn't the kids sit on someone's lap? Or, like, isn't there an extent to which, like, losing a combat soldier is, like, even worse than, all that. But putting aside those nitpicks, just looking at it as the loyalty test that is created, what do you think of it?
I mean, well, so my first thought was like, well, put them both on the helicopter and then just, take care of yourself, like you're a soldier.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So like that, I rejected it immediately, like the premise. And I think the fact that the character didn't, and that I don't know if the audience was expected to or not, but like that was kind of presented as this kind of like twist later. I was kind of like, a lot of these things, I'm like, well, what about option 3? Which maybe it's just watching a lot of Batman, but like, in comic book fiction, usually it's like the third way, right? That's a trope, right?
The Green Goblin says, along comes a villain to make you make a terrible choice, and Spider-Man finds a way to save both.
Right, exactly. Like that's just a very normal kind of thing. And I mean, that tends to be how I think about things usually, is like, well, are the, like, when presented with two options, it's like, are these really my only two options? And I think a lot of good mysteries present you with a binary of it's either this or this. And it's like, no, it's not. It's obviously someone else, right? It's obviously a third person. And so as a test, I feel like the fact that there is a third option, I think, is also interesting in and of itself. And that's maybe the real test, is that it's not a binary, right? But the idea of, like, I mean, I think it's abhorrent, like, to be like, oh, we're gonna take someone and test their loyalty by, like, putting them into, like, when you actually think about the whole situation, it's like, well, they were shooting people, and there were people shooting at them, and like, how often is like this actually going to go right? You get, a valid answer, as opposed to just like, oops, the kid got shot in the head, I guess. It's like, what are we doing here? So, like most things done by spy agencies and militaries, like, I think it's awful. And I'm a particular not a fan of trolley problems. I obviously they set up questions for us here, right? But like, I mean, further, it's like, I do think it is a logical idea to be like, we are going to confront someone with an order that they are not going to want to follow, and then we're going to see whether they're going to follow that. And when you are trying to run a well-oiled machine where your soldiers are weapons, they're not free-thinking individuals, there is a certain logic to basically saying, okay, let's try and make sure that we have people who are going to follow orders without questioning them. And I do think that's a lot of what military training often is. There's also, the idea that, like, it's unethical to follow an unethical order, and that, like, you actually do want your soldiers to disobey certain orders, if, like, that the chain of command shouldn't necessarily be absolute, where, if you can't have this constant questioning all the time, like on every decision, but where sometimes, there is room for agency among individuals, right? And it's like, these aren't drones going around doing things, and sometimes human judgment is actually beneficial. So like, the short answer would be awful, possibly effective, logistically dubious would be kind of my summary.
Well, there's a couple things there. First, I'll say I'm someone who does love trolley problems, but I love them as hypotheticals, and I think that they are, because I do think that to me the whole point of the study of ethics is that I think our emotional responses to things are very important. I think sometimes there is a knee-jerk response to, I want to solve the problem that's immediately in front of me, or the problem that because I can relate to the pain involved or whatever, I have the most immediate emotional response to. And that there's something to be said for stepping back and saying, like, wait a minute, what are my actual values? What are the ethics I follow or whatever? And am I being hypocritical if I do that? Or does that mean I should adjust my and all that kind of questioning and having some kind of a moral system, but that is also very flexible. Trolley problems help towards that, to be sure, as I understand it, but they can also become way too, hypothetical and problematic too. I think you're right that the test is dubious. I think that's also a point of the show, is that this is an organization that is very comfortable with large amounts of collateral damage. Mm-hmm. And that's something we should definitely get to. In terms of the test itself, I think you're right that you have kind of the two different poles to it, because on the one hand, like, let's say the situation is actually, hey, there's a woman who looks like she can take care of herself, but she knows the secret code we can use to turn off the nuclear bomb. There's also a 10-year-old kid who looks really innocent, but there's a good chance that he actually has some C4 strapped to himself, and if you let him on the helicopter, he's going to blow himself up. Mm. And so now there's a legitimate reason why the thing that your emotional knee-jerk response would be of save the kid is actually not what you should do. And I agree that there should be some level of, you don't have to explain that to the soldier. You can just say, trust us. We know that the woman is more important to save than the kid. Save that person. But you're right also that because that gets to a very dangerous place that we're seeing, I think, right now in our own world of, well, my superiors are telling me that this is the right person to save and that this is the right person to abuse, so it's okay. I really like, though, that I felt like the show kind of subverted a lot of that pretty early. Because the response isn't, there's this one woman you have to go save. It's simply prioritize Americans. Mm-hmm. And so it's saying specifically what was happening is we hold American lives to be more valuable than the lives of this country that we've come into to do these terrible things to. And to me, that makes it even easier to say, it is clearly the moral right thing to save the kid. And what they're kind of, or at least with that information, what they're trying to find out is, will you do a shitty moral thing because your superiors asked you to?
Yeah, and I mean, there's the added complexity that, the character being asked to make this choice in this instance is, a first-generation American. His parents were brought to the United States during a period of political turmoil in China, and, there's a certain level of distrust, and that they've kind of been trying to overcome that. Like, they don't even want to speak Chinese most of the time. There's one point where he tries talking to them in Mandarin at that point in time, and they're like, no, in English. I'm like, okay.
Right. If you think Hale is an interesting name for a family of Chinese immigrants, their last name was Han, and they intentionally changed it.
Right, exactly. Which isn't altogether uncommon. I mean, I think it's historically been more common amongst immigrants from Europe who can pass essentially as Anglo whatever, but but it's certainly not unheard of, and so it's like, I think it's taken as a loyalty to not just to the military, but to the country, to America or whatever.
Right.
And
that's a good point. Yeah.
And so the idea that, he would follow his conscience essentially is seen as, maybe to some extent, you have more loyalty to people not born in the United States than to, to people born in the United States. But yeah, it's like a device at the beginning, and then it's brought up again a few more times. But even though it's the title of the show, it doesn't then go on to basically form the like the main. It's not really kind of the core of the show. Although
Yeah.
the interesting thing is that the person who ordered it, and we don't find this out till later, but I think it was clear early on, to me at least, it was somebody who wanted him to fail it. And because they wanted to maybe turn him into their agent, which is its own kind of interesting thing. Like,
Right.
if you're the organization that's doing these things, right, and you're trying to test your own people, like, do you want there to be a record of people who have failed this test and then they're still going to be in your overall system? It's like, that's like,
right.
Probably not. It's like, hey, try and turn these guys. Here's the files of the most likely
Right.
double agents, you know.
And we'll get to that in a minute, but I just want to focus on also the other thing you said about like finding the third way, because I do think that and part of the idea here is, if it sounds like there's wheels within wheels, that's very much the point of this.
Yeah.
The show, as far as I know, basically invents another clandestine organization that is much less known about than CIA or NSA or others like that, called the Orphanage. And, you know, as I said, this is borrowing a lot from Born Identity. It's borrowing a lot from Burn Notice. Here we're straight up borrowing from Watchmen. And that's what they almost say, the exact phrase. They say, like, you know, who should be watching these other people who are watching. And that this organization's aimed primarily at watching, you know, the other organizations, as well as kind of like cleaning up some of their messes and doing its own thing. And it's called the Orphanage. And yeah, to me, I think it feels like the test is being run by one group, but then other groups are looking at it. And the person who we later find out was behind the hack, who we'll get to in a minute, definitely was looking for him to fail. I think that St. George, the woman heading up the Orphanage, she was kind of looking for what you were talking about. Can you find the third path? Can you think, because I think that's also very important, especially for people who aren't just one of 12 soldiers in a squad and then in a platoon, etc., but are people expected to act independently out there, is when faced with a binary choice, can you come up with a third option? And as it turns out, when also then later faced with a binary choice of, like, there's a way in which the Copenhagen Test is exactly recreated by the end of the show.
Yeah.
Where he's basically forced to, will you protect your parents or will you protect your country, your organization? And he finds that third way of putting himself more at risk in order to save both.
Yeah. The triple cross, basically.
Say again?
The triple cross, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Where he's like, I'm betraying you, but I'm actually betraying you while I'm looking like I'm betraying them. And they're going to shoot at me, and that's fine because I've got plot armor. And not that it's like entirely inconceivable, but like the number of things that have to go. So I don't want to get too down this path, but this is one of the things about a lot of things that involve a con or some sort of big spy thing within a thing. Like, when you step back and you look like, okay, so this over, you know, one of the kind of puppet masters, their plan was to have all these things go right. And it's like, so many things could have gone wrong along the way. But having said that, like, maybe they are trusting themselves to be one of those people who can kind of find the third option when there appear, you know, a false dichotomy or a false binary really is what, you know, what we're talking about in these decisions is, you know, they appear to be binary decisions, but rarely are decisions actually you can do one thing or another. Like, the world is full of possibilities, and there are often, you know, options as of yet unconsidered, you know. And, you know, the tough thing with like a spy agent, right, or whatever, is like being able to come up with those solutions like that, right, where you're not blowing your cover, because you know, timing tells are a thing, right, where when somebody makes a decision instantly, you know that like there wasn't a lot of thought that went into it. When somebody takes a while, maybe a bunch of thought, that can be faked. It's hard to fake instant decisions. So like, if you're able to choose that third way instantly, I think that can be difficult for people to like actually read what's going on.
No, I think because a lot of it's also one of the things that they're trying to keep secret throughout all of this is, who do people think that he knows that he's been
Right.
hacked? And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of stuff about, like, if when presented with new information, he has to act like it's new. And so if you're like, oh, okay, that's the problem, here's my solution, you're like, you didn't need to take a few seconds to think about that?
Right.
That's a tell.
Exactly.
Let's talk about collateral damage, because that is an ongoing theme. As I mentioned, yeah, as you said, in order to do this loyalty test, like, people in Belarus get shot. Our main antagonist is the result of kind of collateral damage of a decision by the orphanage in, or at least some spy agency.
Not even though, yeah, I think the
in
CIA
Berlin.
back then.
As I said, the entire nation of Slovakia has its politics changed, because basically they have a chance to stop this guy. They have a chance to stop the assassination of this person who looks like they have a real chance to bring democracy back to Slovakia, and they decide not to in order to not blow their source. Which you can say, well, okay, well, it works in the long run, but also what's the government of Slovakia right now? What's happening to those people? And then, as you mentioned, also it even reaches back all the way to Alexander's parents, because what we learn, and it's all vaguely done, but first of all, you mentioned it happening like at a time of turmoil. It's happening literally around the time of Tiananmen Square, so probably like one of the most publicized, and the politics and the news around Tiananmen Square, like, there are people who will tell you that 500 people were killed. There are people who will tell you 50,000 people were killed. There's an awful lot of both state censorship on the Chinese side and rabid, like, anti-Sino prejudice on the American side. So, but certainly it was a time of secret police cracking down on anti-government activists in really bad ways. So, very legitimate time for Chinese citizens to be concerned. We don't know much, but we know that they were some kind of government scientists. They were some kind of scientists, and that Americans were in some way working with them, and that this American agent named Victor screwed up somehow and basically kind of blew their cover such that they had to come to the United States. And that's part of why they come very afraid and very, like, worried about things, but also that they themselves are Alexander's whole being in America is a result of this collateral damage. And we later learn that Victor is this person who himself becomes a very powerful agent, and it winds up actually being the person who turns Alexander, and we'll get into all that in a second. But let's just talk about collateral damage. What do you think the show is trying to say about collateral damage, and how do you feel about it?
I mean, it's interesting because one of the first things I thought about when they let the would-be president of Slovakia get assassinated is Luthen in Andor not using the intel about I think his name was Krieger, right?
Yeah, that's it. And his 50 agents.
Right, exactly. And just letting them all, go essentially into a trap, right? And so there's that kind of obvious parallel of, like, do you kind of sacrifice some people in order to achieve your overall mission? But, like, the orphanage is not Luthen. The orphanage is the ISB. Yeah. Right. And I mean, obviously in Andor, there is meant to be that kind of mirroring of, I'm damned to use my enemy's methods against them, or whatever that was said slightly more eloquently than my paraphrasing here. But, it's like, this is, in my view, this is a deeply evil organization. Like,
yeah,
but that's hard to, like, separate my own politics or my own viewpoint of the world, my own perspective from, like, I don't think U.S. spy agencies largely are doing good things. I don't think American hegemony is a positive thing for the world. And a lot of people think it is. And so I have always been overall pretty much like, yeah, I think you can justify just about any action if the results of it are some other thing. But, like, in terms of justification, like, for me, it's like, well, no, there are pros and there's cons. There's positive aspects of an outcome and there's negative aspects. And I I don't really believe in weighing them against each other,
Mm-hmm.
like the scales of justice that are kind of like floating behind our heads here in in the YouTube broadcast. Like
Mm-hmm.
I just think you have to accept that all of those things are true, right? Like if you let some people die and then some people conceivably maybe will live as a result, like both of those things happened. And in terms of like netting things out, I feel like it's not there's not a
Mm-hmm.
there's no formula for it. I don't have one. And
Right.
I think anybody who claims to, I think is expressing their viewpoint. I don't
Yeah.
think there's any way of claiming any level of objectivity in this. So it's basically saying, what would you rather have happen? Right? Would you
Right.
rather all these people die and you preserve your hack and then you can potentially get someone who maybe would in the long run be causing more damage? Or would you rather stop this one thing right now with the risk of potentially losing an opportunity to, capture someone who might potentially do more damage? And that's just a choice, and
Mm-hmm.
it could be a binary. It could maybe not be a binary where maybe they could have found a way to save all those people without, like, maybe they could have set it up so that it's not obvious that they made sure that the attack on them, that the assassination was unsuccessful. Like that's
Yeah.
not inconceivable to me that you could have kind of had it both ways where you don't let it be super obvious. You don't make it super obvious, but then again, you're taking a risk there, right?
Right.
So usually a third way, as demonstrated by like the end of this show, usually the third way comes with some level of risk. Where if we look at just the initial Copenhagen test, if he'd said, okay, the kid and the woman are going to get on the chopper,
Mm-hmm.
and like I'm just going to figure shit out for myself. Like, yeah, that's a certain level of risk for that person, right?
Right.
And so, um, yeah, I basically think that this is a deeply evil organization that views its actions as pragmatic when really they are selfish in a very they are trying to protect themselves sort of way. And I
Yeah.
think in this exact example that we're talking about, when they allow this thing to happen because they want to capture this hack thing, to me, that's very clearly an act of self-preservation and
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily like, I don't think they make a compelling argument that this is like for the greater good. I think it's like it's clearly for their good, and they're trying to sell themselves on the idea that it's just the pragmatic way to try and fulfill their overall mission, when I think
Yeah.
it's just an act of self-preservation, really.
No, I think you're exactly right there because, often what things like this will do is say, okay, but no matter what bad thing you think our theoretical heroes are doing, remember that it's nothing next to the evil that the other side's doing. Luthen does make some absolutely bloodthirsty choices, but he's doing it against a group that we know is going to destroy a whole planet with 1 billion people on it soon, and is also already doing like horrible genocidal things. Here, to me, I think one of the things that one of the reasons why I am most concerned about groups that say our mission is so right and so good that any and all evil acts are justified in the sake of that mission is that very quickly I think you get into the idea that the preservation of our own selves is necessary, and thus anything we can do becomes necessary. And that's everything from all the terrible things the American government has done to Catholic Church, covering up horrible misdeeds by its own members because we can't sully the name of the church, to individual families being like, oh, we can't, talk about this terrible person, to a president who's probably on an Epstein list, but we can't let people know that, like, and I think what I really like is that the show exactly that it makes it about that. It makes it that we get to the point where once you realize that what this group wants, what the people who have this leak are trying to do is to take down the orphanage itself, then the orphanage is only acting out of self-preservation. And people have heard me on this show for a while know that one of my biggest things is accountability. Is that I think that once you start down the road of I am allowing myself to have power that could be abused because I think that my choices, my goals are justified, and I don't think I'll abuse them. I think it becomes necessary for some degree of accountability. For someone else to look in and go, hey, just because anyone can be emotionally compromised, do you mind if I look over your shoulder? Because as I said, that's why I get so scared by Captain America's, you make yourself like a tree and say, no, you move. Because what if he's wrong? And granted, Tony's a lot more wrong in that, but my point. And I feel like that's what so much of this is about. And I really like the way that was done. And so let's get to who is doing it, because and all this is done very subtly, but tell me if you're on the same page as I am. For the most part, we get no mention that there's any ideology happening until we find out that the person who basically put these nanites into his body, and it's in a really interesting way, where because the nanites are put into the anti-anxiety meds that he's taken, which somehow he can smash a pill and then his phone zooms in quite enough to see the molecular structure. Again, I was like, okay, I'm rolling my eyes.
He's got a spy phone, Matthew. It's got really good zoom.
Really, really good zoom.
This show is clearly in the spy-fi category.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. There's some technology that you just don't ask questions about.
Yeah, which honestly, most Bond things also were in terms of the technology involved then. So
there's no way an Aston Martin can go that fast while carrying that much armor and weaponry. And yeah, exactly. But yeah, the point being, so his ex-fiancée is this doctor who gave him the medications. And when she's confronted about it, she kind of mentions that, she's confronted by someone else in the organization about it, and she mentions the ideology and why she's doing it. And that's
someone in her organization.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Right, who had been kind of blackmailed into doing it. And then she's like, oh, that's not why I'm doing this.
Right. And I mentioned burn notice. There's a lot of that, of people who get burned themselves or in danger of being burned, and they're sort of forced to work for the Shadow Organization. But she says no, that there's some ideology at work. And until pretty much the last 10 minutes of the movie, when we go full-on Return of the King and have 5 different endings, there's no hobbits jumping on a bed, and I think the endings are better, where I was kind of left like, but wait, what's the ideology? Eventually,
come back in season 2.
Yeah. Eventually, though, we learn that, and this is something I kind of guessed, but I thought they kept hidden pretty well. But also that wasn't a huge surprise. That Victor, that person who had been responsible for screwing up, causing the Hans to have to come to America, then really becomes kind of like an uncle to Alexander. In part because the mother, he's like, okay, I got you out, I'm done. And the mother's like, no, you have to basically be his godfather. And so he brings him into the spy organization. And he gets out of the spy organization, and you quickly learn that he's very unhappy with it. And so at the very end, you do find out that, he was the one Paul was talking about who was probably kind of rooting for Alexander to fail the Copenhagen Test. In part because of that, that's kind of his final confirmation. He moves forward with a plan to hack Alexander. And we're not really told much about it, but we're basically told that he's part of some organization. Maybe he's the head of it, maybe he's just part of it, but that has some goal in mind. And then, among other things, they have hacked numerous other people. That Alexander is not the only one. Which is also interesting because one of the things they technologically set up as kind of to add some tension is that the whole hacking project is called the Cassandra Project, which is kind of a perfect name. And but that eventually it'll kill you. So how are these other people still alive? Well, they figured out a way to keep him alive, so maybe. But yeah, to me, what it was kind of setting up is that he has some kind of ideology of maybe that organizations like the orphanage are wrong and terrible and thus have to be torn down. Maybe that the United States is wrong and terrible because they set up the orphanage. Maybe that Western capitalism is, or that humanity is and they're total anarchists. We have no idea. But
that the orphanage is supposed to be the watchmen. They're the watchers watching the watchmen.
So who watches them?
And exactly. And so It's like as you said,
This is the Russian nesting doll I'm talking about.
Exactly.
Is that accurate understanding of how you understand it? We're kind of setting up for season 2. We're going to have maybe more of an ideological reasoning for why these people are doing what they're doing.
I think so, yeah. And my feeling was it probably was they feel like they need to watch the people who are watching the other spy agencies who are watching the people. So like, but then the question is like, well, then who watches them watching the other people who are watching the other people who are watching the people? So, yeah. But like they could have a much different ideology, and like, I don't know, I guess we'll find out, or we won't. And that's very Burn Notice, Burn Notice did 7 seasons of this, layers of the onion, or doll within a doll within a doll within a doll within a doll. And I didn't want to say 7 times, but literally they do it 7 times. It's like, it's outrageous. And it turns out to be like, this like rogue spy agency, non-governmental spy agency, like for good. But then it's like, but are they?
Yeah.
And so, I feel like it's probably heading down that path. Yeah, I think your summary's good. This Victor it's weird to me that he's like Donnie Douglas from Frasier. He's Daphne's ex-fiance, which I know he's in a ton of other things too.
Yeah.
And the actor has a name, but I'm trying not to type on my keyboard too much because it makes a lot of noise.
I appreciate that.
But yeah, it's Saul Rubinek actually. But I from the beginning I was like, oh, he's the guy. And then like as it went on, I was like, maybe he's not the guy. Maybe he's not the guy. Well, there's this other guy. There's that guy. And then at the end, it's like, he's the guy.
Yeah, no, that's what I meant about it. Kind of sets it up a little bit at the beginning.
Yeah,
like,
for sure. Yeah, it makes it feel like that's the most likely thing. But then, they successfully give you these false binaries. Oh, it could be this. It could be this. It could be this.
Yeah.
But although they did say early on, like, well, actually, the Wi-Fi signal is going in 2 different directions. It's splitting. It's like, well, yeah. So then there's going to be some further, when you're watching something and you're like, there's still 20 minutes of runtime in this thing. Like this wrapped up too neatly already.
Yeah.
But yeah, it sounds like this Cassandra project was like a CIA thing that they were doing, or maybe it was DOD. I forget. I think it was CIA. But it was some government or agency that exists in our world that did this project. They just kept killing people, and then they shelved it. But then apparently, I think this secret organization found the tech and kind of figured out how to like make it actually work without killing everybody who uses it.
Right.
And that Alexander Hale isn't necessarily the first person who's got this new stuff in them, but like they've got, maybe a dozen or whatever agents out throughout the world who maybe some of them know, maybe some of them don't know. And, it's interesting at the end, it's kind of framed like, oh, well, I did this to you because I trust you so much, and like we're going to be great spy pals now. But it's also kind of like, like, how many times you almost got him shot? Like,
yeah, and that
get him stabbed. Like he got stabbed in the gut.
Oh yeah,
by his girlfriend or ex-girlfriend.
Yeah,
never let your ex-girlfriend come over and make soup for you when
Okay, did that not feel a bit like Chekhov's soup? Like I kept waiting for the soup to be thrown at somebody.
Right. Yeah. No, I feel you. Yeah. It turned out to just be Chekhov's knife.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and let's actually. I want to use the girlfriend to talk about the last issue of something else that this is a different kind of ethical thing, but that you and I have talked before a lot about how I really like romance when it's in shows. You often don't, but that we both, I think, are frustrated when a romantic plotline feels tacked on as a way to kind of like generate human interest in the story, and that often it winds up being not really great to the female characters involved.
Yeah.
Especially when there's love triangles. And a lot of stuff that I don't love as much of spy thrillers, especially Bond, but other things, will often set up a love triangle where there is one potential partner who represents the 2 different sides that our hero could choose. This doesn't go really in that direction ever. Well, actually, no, it sort of does, because there's some hints of maybe he's going to get back together with his ex, and also he has this girlfriend who is, she kind of knows, he knows that she knows that Anakin could be a threat to them. He knows that she knows about the hack, but he thinks that she's being genuine in her affections towards him. It turns out, so her name is, well, we're told her name is Michelle. We learn at the very end that that's just yet another cover name. But basically, like, she's, as part of the attempt to monitor Alexander as we figure out the hack, she's ordered to kind of keep an eye on him and maybe to, fall for him or act like she's falling for him, etc., and make him fall for her. But he believes to some extent that she's genuine. Meanwhile, at the same time, this analyst named Parker, who is pretty new to the organization, but is clearly brilliant and is very, very good at reading people and at predicting behavior.
And manipulating them.
Yes, exactly. And so she is supposed to basically be writing the scripts that Michelle, and also everybody who Alexander encounters, who's meant to kind of manipulate him. And that, for those who don't know the Cyrano de Bergerac reference, that's a story about, one guy asks his friend to help him get this woman to fall in love with them. And so Cyrano, who's not considered as attractive as the friend, basically writes all the love notes that his friend gives to her. But in the course of it, he realizes that he's actually in love with her, and she realizes that she's in love with the guy who's writing the love notes, etc. And there's a couple moments early on where it feels like there's a bit of tension between Parker and Michelle about which one of them knows Alexander best, and which one of them is actually really connecting with him. And there are a couple of moments where Parker feels like someone who is a little resentful that she's the one who knows Alexander, and maybe even is developing some like fondness for him or attraction to him, but that Michelle is the one who's actually getting to do all of it. At the same time, both of these actresses are incredibly attractive women, incredibly great actresses, but they're played as though Michelle is someone who really kind of looks the part of, a very attractive person. Parker is much more kind of a bookworm who doesn't take care of herself in quite the same way. So in that same kind of Cyrano feeling, I think we're supposed to think that Parker feels like the person who the handsome spy man isn't going to look at first when Michelle is there. And so that's part of that feeling. And it felt, I got actively worried that that's where we were going, that there was going to be some sort of tension between these two. It felt like that got diffused pretty early on, though, after some like just initial completely believable tension, and never became the kind of forced love triangle I was worried about. Was that something that was on your mind as you were watching? How did you approach all that?
I wouldn't say I was ever that concerned it was going to go in that direction. I do think, they made it seem like, oh, maybe maybe Michelle's actually into Alexander. And then they made it clear, oh no, this is just more manipulation. Right. And it turns out that the only like real thing she ever said was she had to kind of like improvise, because Alexander was like, oh, he's trying to get some particular answer like really quickly, right? And he's like, no thinking about it, So it's like basically saying you can't have a timing tell, right? Yeah. And then she just said, I like to go to graveyards. And then Parker's like, oh, that's a good, interesting answer. And it's like, it actually turns out to be true, right? Yeah. That's like the only thing we actually know about her is she likes to go sit in graveyards when she's pensive or whatever. And I thought it was interesting how Alexander clearly knew that like Parker was a person, that there was like someone back there pulling the strings that he probably hadn't met. Maybe he thinks it is somebody that he knows and he doesn't know who it is. I didn't feel necessarily like the sort of romance thing that you're talking about. But I can see how that makes sense, Yeah. But I do appreciate that they kept it kind of sort of sterile in a way, right? Where it is like, there's all of the romance is fake, basically, Right. But then he talks to his ex-fiance, who's the one who actually gave him the brain stuff and, the nanites. And she's like, well, it wasn't all fake. Right. And it's like, how's someone gonna believe that? But it's like, I think she was like, oh, we'll go to this cabin where I'll be able to do these medical experiments on you. And then he's like, let's get married. And she's like, oh, shit.
Yeah. No, I thought that was also really well done. And similarly, I thought maybe him and Michelle are going to ride off into the sunset or something.
Sure, yeah.
And that's not that. I think there's the indication that she did develop some genuine feelings for him. But also, when she was ordered to kill him, she tried to kill him straight up.
I mean, she stabbed him in the stomach and then just kept trying to,
and then they have a moment at the end where like she's out of the agency entirely, and he is like, "Do you want to tell me your real name?" And he's like, "No, of course you can't do that." And she says, "When you're out of all of this, come find me."
Yeah.
Which to me indicates like, yeah, there was a genuine human connection there, but that they're both like, to me, I was like, there was so much fakeness here. You can't just start dating now. Like, and she's like, so I liked having that, like, yeah, there's a little door open, but like, you got to be done with all this spy shit,
Yeah, like it feel like it could be the end of the Bourne Identity, where some surf store and, like you walk in, it's like everything's actually over. You're actually out of the thing, which, seems unlikely when your brain's been hacked and there's no real way to like get these nanites out of you, but who knows? But yeah, I do, it's interesting because I did feel myself like taken in, and I felt like, oh, this is all fake. But then I was like, I kind of don't think it really is. Like, I think she actually has some of those feelings and there's like stuff going on, but she's extremely skilled as a spy, as able to really fake these things. And I think it's also just very sociopathic. Like, and I mean, that's a tendency they look for in these agencies, right? But it's like, that doesn't mean that there's not some emotion there. It just means that she has the ability to subvert her emotion just like completely when she deems it necessary. And
I just want to fill in one detail there that I think is really essential, is that part of how she connects with him, and where I think we as the audience, and I certainly me, and it sounds like you as well, for a moment believe that she's being genuine with him, is when he's like, come on, I kind of know you're assigned to me. And she's like, yeah. And then she says a couple of things about how she's very frustrated with the agency and how they're treating him. And this kind of like, you and I we're both victims here. We're tossed together, but I'm on your side. Yeah. And then we learned that those exact lines were scripted for her.
Right.
And that's where like, oh, that was a great reveal, I thought.
I agree. And like, it's funny because it's like, it's revealed that those lines were scripted for her and thus it was fake. But that doesn't actually mean that the sentiment isn't true, right? Yeah. It means that the sentiment wasn't the origin of the statement, but like you can say lines that are true, right? Like you can deliver a speech that you believe, even if it's like made up of lies in a way.
Yeah.
Right. It's the old, politicians use the truth to tell lies, and actors use lies to tell the truth, kind of.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's not like in V for Vendetta. That feels like a V for Vendetta thing.
It sounds like that. I think it also sounds like it's something that could be Shakespeare,
It's like, something somewhere, yeah. But the point being that like you can be bullshitting someone, but like you can actually emotionally on some level be coming from a place of truth. I mean, sometimes that's the best way to sell a lie, right? Is to like actually kind of believe it yourself on some level.
And I think it also really shows how, which I think is in some ways to me the two most critical things the show is willing to say about the orphanage is, one is the collateral damage, but two is also the way that the system seduces you into like being part of the system. Because I think, it's that idea of like, it knows that its own agents are going to be really frustrated with it. So it's going to encourage them to use that legitimate frustration and anger to further its goals. And similarly, we learned that Parker was almost on the verge of quitting the organization when she gets this mission, and then winds up to basically be the handler of Alexander, and then ends it as this big promotion and totally bought into the organization. And to me, that all kind of, it's like, this is how insidious these organizations are, is that they find ways to work all your frustration, all your anger at the organization, it's still going to take and use.
Yeah. And having said that, I think she's also got a very interesting arc of, she goes from like, she wants to quit the organization, not because she thinks they're doing a bunch of bad stuff. She wants to quit because she feels like they're not listening to her. Right. And then they listen to her, they give her a lot of power, and she's into it, but she doesn't like the collateral damage, right?
Yeah.
And basically, the head of the agency, the St. George character, basically tells her, you know, hey, look, like here's a book to like basically write all the people that you killed that weren't like you didn't want to kill them, but you kind of sacrifice them to the cause, right? And then just bury it somewhere or something, which seems like, I don't know, that seems like a terrible idea. Like from I mean, not just like from an emotional level, but also from a pragmatic, like really, you want a written record of a list of like your worst, that like, come on, burn it, write their name down and then burn it. Fine.
Yeah.
You know? But she's like, I'm not going to do that. She keeps not writing the names in it. And then she writes like, I think something like people I've saved or whatever. Right. And so I think she's like on this journey of like, she's in this organization that's given her a ton of power and basically told her like, hey, these sorts of things are unavoidable. And like, I think she's on the like, can I find the third way? You know, because at the end she was like, okay, well, we're either going to use this connection to try and catch the guy, or we're going to, you know, kill Alexander. And then she's like, oh, go ahead, kill him. Like, you know, but she does that because he gave her the information that he wanted her to have to then be able to figure out like that it was actually like a triple cross, that she actually was giving the information to the other guy. And so like she did kind of like figure that out, or did figure that out. Right. And then did come around to, I think this like, I think she's in an interesting place too, of like, does she believe the ends justify the means? And are there like, their overall mission isn't really questioned, right? It's just like, are their methods like a worthy way of achieving their mission? And I feel like if there's a second season, I think it will be more questioning of the overall mission, because you know, we get that nesting doll kind of going on. But I do think just in terms of like what the organization itself is actually doing, I thought, you know, her kind of decisions and thoughts about like whether it made sense to kind of go to these lengths were very interesting. I thought she was a very interesting character in that regard, especially. And then I thought Michelle was like a super interesting character, where it's like we only get kind of hints of her backstory, and like I think she really is on that kind of like, she's kind of just trying to survive, you know, and like she's not a true believer, you know. It's like she's just like she
has the red marks in her ledger.
Exactly.
Like Black Widow,
exactly. And so I would be curious, like, is she actually out of season 2 if there's a season 2? Is she, you know, or is she that kind of like character who comes back later after like having kind of gone away, but actually, you know, is, you know, and like did Parker really not read her file, or did she read her file?
Parker destroyed her file in theory.
She destroyed her file, but then she said, you know, did you read it first? She's like, no, I didn't want to. I'm like, okay. Maybe.
And we also know that Parker's a very curious person. And
exactly.
And
I'm suspicious.
One last thing on that, and then we can wrap up. Do you have any last thoughts? I thought one of the most effective scenes in the movie is, because in many ways, like, Simu Liu is the star, and I think in many ways he is the chief protagonist. But Parker's like pretty damn close in terms of being a protagonist. And I actually found
she's the protagonist of episode 2, I would say. You know, and they kind of play that dual
kind of go back and forth, And but she's also, I think, our main POV for the collateral damage in that because she's very much just she's been looking at the book. She hasn't, and so they let her watch through, you know, they let her watch what happens in the Slovakia mission, and she watches as, because of the actions that she's recommended, you know, people are killed. This presidential candidate and his family, his kids are all killed. And she is clear, like, she throws up. She's clearly very emotionally shaken and has flashbacks to it. And I thought that was, again, just such a powerful device of showing, like, yeah, she is bothered by this. And and I will say, we keep talking about season 2. There's been no announcement that season 2 is being made. I hope it is. So please go watch the show, because I want to see season 2.
It'll help. It's on Peacock, which I think is... Actually, maybe this is a good time to be on Peacock, because they've got the Olympics. I think the Winter Olympics are starting soon. So, if you get Peacock and, watch some Olympics, watch the Copenhagen Test.
Yeah, it's definitely worthwhile. Any last thoughts you want to add in before we close out?
I guess not a lot. I mean, I'd say just, I think it's interesting that spy stuff there's a lot of questioning of like what spy agencies do, but some shows or movies do really manage to sidestep that. And I think it's interesting that they chose to sidestep it for like a full season, basically, and really only ask the question, like, are these okay things for them to do to achieve their mission, rather than actually asking, like, is their mission a good mission, right. And maybe that's in their best interest in terms of like, in this world in which we live in, being like not clearly on one side or the other, and letting people. I do generally appreciate when shows let us kind of have our own opinions about certain things. At the same time, I think there are spots when it's like, yeah, it's like Star Wars isn't like, ooh, do you think the Empire's right? No, Yeah. So I'm very curious. Like, I do hope that there's a second season, partially because this is a little bit more of a tangent. I'll keep it short. Sure. When Shang-Chi came out, after having seen him in Kim's Convenience, I kind of thought Simu Liu would be like the next kind of like big like movie star who was gonna, the way like Chris Hemsworth and Chris Evans and Chris Pratt like end up being in like a ton of things after they get their Marvel character, and he's been in a number of things for sure, but like hasn't really gotten that kind of like star turn as a protagonist, as like an action hero. And I found that a little surprising, a little disappointing, but like it's nice to see him get his own series where he's a star. He's the main, he's like the 1A protagonist, and then we have a 1B protagonist, basically, right? Where the first episode is really through his eyes, and is a producer on the show too. So I am happy to see that, and hope the show succeeds, even just like kind of on those grounds.
Yeah, I really like that. I want him to have an active role, both because he specifically is awesome, but also just more Asian leading men in like sexy, action hero roles is great. The cast itself is incredibly diverse, with a lot of actors where I was like, a lot of the actors I've seen as like bit parts in other things and been like, oh, they're awesome. I would love for them to get more roles, and here they do. There's just, it's definitely like, it doesn't feel woke in any way, but it feels like it's going to be accused of being woke many times. And that's,
based on like casting choices, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sure. And but all of them are like fantastic. Like, I didn't think anyone was really miscast in the show.
I
just, so yeah. And just that last thing you brought up, like, to me, if a show says we just want to talk about the means to the ends and not think about the ends, I'll be like, that's interesting, but what about the actual ends? Here I think they kind of like squared that circle well by saying, okay, we want you to think about the means to the ends this season. Don't worry, we're gonna get to those actual mission in a second,
right?
But let's focus on this first as kind of a step by step thing. And so maybe season 2 they don't do that, but if they go, I think it'll be interesting. Well, Paul, this has been great as always. You, I know, are writing these days. Give us a quick 10 seconds about that and where they can find it.
Yeah. They can find it on zenmadman.com, which is finally operational again after some years of inactivity. I've been writing a weekly blog/newsletter called Friday Night is My Monday Morning. It's primarily about poker. Maybe it's entirely about poker, but I kind of end up talking about other stuff here and there. And then I have a current challenge, which is like the main thrust of that right now, called Betting the House on Poker, where I am trying over the next, 1,001 days, although now I'm down to 952 days remaining, to make enough money to buy a house or pay off the house that I already have. So, it's fun. And for me, it's just like, it's something that I have to write each week. I've committed to it, and that's helping me do some other writing as well, which is something I've wanted to do for since this podcast began,
Right.
Do more writing basically. So yeah.
No, it's awesome. I've been enjoying those. I think people should definitely sign up and follow all that and check it out. Of course, you can check out my other podcast, Star Wars Generations. We're having a lot of fun going through the Clone Wars, as well as talking about some other relevant stuff. A lot of new Star Wars content coming out this year that we're excited for. So on behalf of myself and Paul, thank you so much. Fuck ice.
Word.
So.